Okay, think about this. Children walking, like 15 miles in just 6 hours. Or boys working night shifts right next to these incredibly hot furnaces, maybe 90 degrees. Or landowners actually tearing down homes just to dodge taxes.
Yeah, it sounds pretty grim, doesn't it? And these aren't, from some Dickens novel. They're actually details from the sources we're looking at today.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into some selected excerpts from Karl Marx's big work, Capital, A Critique of Political Economy. We've got bits from Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3.
And yes, it's definitely dense stuff, no doubt about it. But it's packed with insights that have really shaped economic thinking for, well, over a century now.
So our mission here is to guide you through some of the most important ideas, those nuggets of knowledge, and maybe some surprising facts that are buried in these specific texts we have.
Right. Think of it as a way to get a handle on the underlying mechanics of the economy, at least as analyzed through this particular very influential lens.
Exactly. We're getting into the fabric of economic systems, but not just in theory. The sources are full of these really vivid, sometimes, frankly, shocking historical details.
And actually, before we even jump into the main concepts, the sources give us a little peek behind the curtain of how the work itself came together. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, you'd probably imagine a huge book like this being written pretty straightforwardly, Volume 1, then Volume 2, then Volume 3.
But it turns out, and this is noted in the material, the actual manuscripts for Volumes 2 and 3 were drafted before the final version of Volume 1 was even finished.
Which is kind of surprising, right?
It really is. It just shows you what a complex, evolving project it was over many, many years. Not just a straight line from A to B, more like layers, building up these interconnected ideas.
Okay, so let's start where Volume 1, the published version anyway, begins. That's with the basics, the foundations of value.
Right. And the core idea presented there is pretty clear. In this framework, value ultimately stems from social labor, human work, basically.
And this is set up against other ideas, right? Like those that say value or surplus value comes from the productivity of capital, machines, technology.
Exactly. The argument here isn't that machines aren't productive. Obviously, they help make more stuff. But the claim is that the new value added during a certain period of work, that still comes from the labor itself.
Okay. So the machinery helps produce a greater quantity, maybe faster, but it doesn't, according to this view, create fresh value all by itself.
Precisely. Which leads to a really helpful example in the sources, trying to illustrate this difference between transmitting value and creating new value.
Oh, yeah, the spinner example.
That's the one. So imagine you have an English textile factory, state-of-the-art automatic spinning machines, and then you have, say, a Chinese artisan using a traditional spinning wheel.
Okay.
Now, the texts ask us to imagine them working for the same amount of time, same effort, same intensity. According to this analysis, they both create the same amount of new value in that hour, or whatever the time period is.
Because it's the same amount of labor going in.
Exactly. But obviously, the English factory produces way, way more yarn, and the total value of all that yarn is much higher.
So why is that then?
Well, the argument is it's not because the labor in the factory is creating more new value per hour. It's because that labor is transmitting the value of the means of production, the expensive machinery, the large amount of cotton, much, much faster into the final product.
Right. So the cost of the machine and the materials gets passed on.
It's passed on, yeah. The value of those means of production goes up with productivity because you're using fancier machines or more materials. But the new value added by that hour of labor itself stays the same in this example.
Okay, that distinction is key. Machines transmit value, labor creates new value.
Got it.
So building on that foundation, let's talk about a concept that sounds a bit abstract, maybe, but is really central to how this whole system is seen to work. Commodity fetishism.
Fetishism, okay.
Yeah.
The source describes it as when we live in a society where basically everything is produced to be sold as a commodity.
The relationships between people, like workers and employers or different producers, they start to look like relationships between things.
That's right.
Between the products themselves.
Yeah, and what's really crucial here, according to the text, is that this isn't just some kind of mistake in our heads, like false consciousness.
Oh.
The argument is it's an objective necessity. It's kind of forced on us by how the system is set up, because everyone's doing their work privately, independently.
Right.
The only way that private work gets validated as being, useful social labor is after the fact,
Yeah.
when the commodity actually sells on the market for money.
Ah, I see. So the social connection isn't direct between people, it's indirect. It appears as a property of the thing, its price, its exchangeability.
Exactly. Money becomes this sort of external thing
Yeah.
that embodies the social character of all that separate private labor.
So in this view, money and commodities aren't just neutral tools. They take on these hidden social powers, almost like they have inherent qualities they don't really possess.
Precisely. It makes human effort look like a characteristic of an object. It's a really interesting, if complex, idea.
Okay, let's shift from that maybe more abstract idea to the very concrete reality described in the sources about working conditions, particularly the length of the working day.
Oh, absolutely. These accounts are incredibly vivid. They really paint a picture of the intense struggles over limiting work hours.
Like the steel manufacturers, Naylor and Vickers.
Yeah, employing hundreds of people. And the sources describe boys under 18 working night shifts in temperatures hitting, 86 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow. And their main reason for resisting change.
Cost, basically. They said they could easily replace the boys if they got worn out. Skilled labor was the harder thing to find. It's quite stark.
And the report on glass manufacturing from the Children's Employment Commission, that's just as rough.
It really is. They objected to giving kids regular meal breaks because it would mean a waste of heat from the furnaces.
A waste of heat.
Yeah. And the commissioner, who's quoted in the source, has this sharp response, basically saying, "You seem more worried about wasting heat than wasting the animal power of these growing children who desperately need food and rest."
And the distances they walked, just carrying things back and forth, 15, maybe 20 miles in a 6-hour shift, working 14, 15 hours total.
It makes it really clear how resistant capital or business owners were to shortening that working day. Any break, any rest, was seen purely through the lens of cost and lost production time.
It contrasts sharply with some older historical accounts mentioned, suggesting workers maybe had more breaks in earlier times.
Definitely. So what happened then when legal limits were finally imposed, like the Factory Act's limiting hours?
Well, the response, according to these texts, was to push harder on intensity.
Exactly. If you can't make people work longer, make them work harder, faster, in the time they do have. The sources talk about speeding up machinery, demanding more effort.
And factory inspectors themselves apparently noted this. They saw this exhausting state of excitement and linked it to health issues like lung disease.
Right. It created this new pressure.
But here's a really fascinating point that's mentioned, almost counterintuitive.
What's that?
English industry, it says, actually advanced faster during the period when the 10-hour day was introduced, around 1848, than it had before, when hours were 12 or even unrestricted.
Huh. That is interesting. So maybe the shorter hours forced more innovation or efficiency?
Could be. But the text also suggests that the increased intensity then caused its own problems, leading to demands for even further reductions in hours. It shows this constant push and pull.
The real dynamic tension, yeah.
The sources also spend some time on what's called primitive accumulation, which sounds a bit academic, but it's described as the sort of hidden backstory, the prehistory of this whole capitalist system.
Right, and it's painted not as some gentle, gradual process. It's described as a really violent, forced separation.
Separation of people from what?
From their land, primarily, but also from their tools, their means of survival. The language used in the source is pretty strong. Terrible and arduously accomplished expropriation, merciless barbarism, driven by infamous, sordid passions.
So the argument is this process created the conditions for capitalist private property where some people own the means of production and others have nothing but their ability to work.
Exactly. Exploiting the labor of others who are now formally free but lack their own means to produce. And this, the text argues, replaced an older kind of private property, one based on your own labor with your own tools or land.
And there are specific, quite brutal examples given.
Yeah, like how the poor laws actually incentivize big land.
That's incredible.
And the Irish example is just so vivid. People being literally banished, cleared off the land to make way for sheep and cattle farming, especially after the corn laws were abolished, making pasture more profitable.
And then they reappear.
On the other side of the Atlantic, as Fenians, involved in Irish nationalism. It directly links this economic transformation, this enclosure of land, to massive social upheaval, displacement, and even political resistance.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot from Volume 1 value, how it seems hidden, the working day, this violent backstory. Let's shift gears. Volume 2 as presented here, seems more focused on how capital moves, the flow, the circulation.
That's a good way to put it. If volume 1 is about creating value and surplus value, volume 2 is about its journey through the economy. This is where we get the idea of the circuits of capital. Yeah, the idea that capital isn't just a static thing, it's constantly moving, changing form. It starts as money capital, M, which buys commodity, C, labor power, and means of production. These are used in production, P, to create new commodities, which contain surplus value, C, and then these are sold to get more money. So you have these cycles, like MCPCM.
Okay, MCPCM, it's a loop.
Kind of, yeah. And the crucial point for the economy as a whole, what the text calls social capital, is that all these forms exist at the same time. Some capital is money, some is being used in factories, some is sitting as finished goods waiting to be sold. It's continuous.
Right. It's not like everything stops while one batch goes through the cycle.
Exactly. And this leads into the idea of the reproduction schema. It sounds complicated, but it's basically a way to map out how the whole system keeps itself going, year after year.
How does that work?
Well, the sources simplify it by dividing all production into two big departments. Department I makes means of production machines, raw materials, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And Department 2 makes means of consumption, food, clothes, housing, everything people buy to live.
Right. Producers' goods and consumer goods, basically.
Essentially, yeah. And the schema shows how these two departments have to constantly exchange things with each other just to keep production going at the same level. This is called simple reproduction.
So Department I needs food for its workers. Department 2 needs machines for its factories.
Exactly. Department I sells machines and materials to Department 2. Department 2 sells food and clothes to the workers and the capitalists in both departments.
And money flows between them to make this happen.
Precisely. Money is the mediator. What a worker in Department I spends on bread that's revenue for them becomes capital for the baker in Department 2, who then uses that money to buy flour, maybe from someone linked to Department 2. These flows keep replenishing everything.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is. And the speed at which this happens really matters. That brings us to circulation time and turnover, which Volume 2 also looks at.
Turnover time. That's how long it takes for capital to go through the whole circuit and come back as money.
Right. And that total time is made up of two parts. The time actually spent in production and the time spent in circulation, which is mostly selling the finished product, CM, and then buying new inputs, MC.
And the sources seem to suggest that selling part, the CM, is often the tricky bit, the bottleneck.
Often, yeah. Turning those commodities back into money can take time, effort, advertising, transport, all that.
But getting the capital to turn over faster, especially the part spent on wages, the variable capital, that's important.
Hugely important for profitability. The source gives a numerical example principle showing how a smaller amount of variable capital that turns over, say, 10 times a year can actually generate a much higher annual rate of surplus value on the initial investment than a much larger chunk of capital that only turns over once a year.
Ah, because you're realizing the surplus value more often.
Exactly. You get your profit back quicker, you can reinvest it quicker, you keep incorporating labor power continuously. So speeding up that cycle, cutting down circulation time, is a constant pressure in the system. It boosts the annual rate of profit on the capital you put in.
Okay. And there was also a quick point about fixed versus circulating capital and a critique of Adam Smith.
Yeah, it's a distinction about how different parts of capital transfer their value. Fixed capital, like a big machine or a building, lasts a long time. It transfers its value piece by piece over many production cycles, many turnovers.
Right, through depreciation.
Kind of, yeah. Whereas circulating capital, think raw materials, or the value paid in wages, transfers its entire value into the product in just one turnover. It gets used up completely and has to be replaced each cycle.
And the critique of Smith.
The source suggests Smith sometimes confused circulating capital, which is part of the productive capital, with capital that's simply in the form of circulation, like money capital or commodity capital waiting to be sold. A bit of a technical distinction maybe, but important for the analysis here.
Okay, got it. So that covers the flow. Let's move to Volume 3. If 1 is creation and 2 is movement, Volume 3 sounds like it's about splitting the spoils, profits, rents. Where does the surplus value actually end up?
That's a great way to put it. Volume 3 really tackles how that surplus value, generated back in production, gets distributed among different groups. And a key distinction right away is between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit.
We touched on this slightly, but remind us.
Sure. The rate of surplus value, often written as S prime, SE, is a ratio of the surplus value, S to just the variable capital, V, the money spent on wages. It measures the degree of exploitation of labor, essentially. But the rate of profit, P prime, P pre, is the ratio of that same surplus value to the total capital invested, that's constant capital C for machines, materials, plus variable capital V. So PAC's C plus V.
And the crucial point from the source examples
Is that these two rates don't always move together. You can have a very high or even rising rate of surplus value workers are being exploited more intensely, but the rate of profit can still stagnate or even fall.
How does that happen?
It happens especially when the constant capital part C grows much larger relative to the variable capital part V. Think heavy automation, lots of expensive machinery, fewer workers relative to the total investment.
Right.
Even if you squeeze more surplus value out of each worker, high S, that surplus value now has to be spread over a much larger total investment, big C plus V. So the rate of profit on the total investment can drop.
So more machines doesn't automatically mean a higher profit rate for the investor?
Not necessarily, no. It's a key potential contradiction highlighted in the text. Changes in wages also obviously affect these rates too.
Makes sense. Okay. Volume 3 also brings in commercial capital, right? The merchants.
Yes. How do they fit in? They don't directly produce anything, so where does their profit come from?
Good question.
The analysis says commercial capital doesn't create new surplus value, but it gets a share of the surplus value that was already created back in production.
How?
It relates to this concept called the price of production. This is basically the price that industrial capitalists aim to sell their goods at. It covers their costs, C plus V, plus an average rate of profit on their total capital.
An average rate across all industries.
Yeah, the idea is that capital tends to flow toward more profitable sectors, which evens out profit rates towards an average over time. And crucially, this average rate is calculated on the total social capital, which includes the capital used by merchants too. So the merchant typically buys the commodity from the producer at or near this price of production. Then they sell it to the final consumer at a higher price, closer to its full value. That difference is the commercial profit.
So they're essentially realizing or collecting a part of the surplus value that the industrialists produced but didn't fully realize themselves.
Exactly. The merchant facilitates the whole selling process, the CM part of the circuit, and gets a cut of the total surplus value for doing that job.
Okay. Now, another big claimant on the surplus value in Volume 3 is landowners, ground rent.
Yes, especially in agriculture, but also urban land. Ground rent is presented as another slice of the surplus value pie, handed over to the owner of the land.
And the sources break it down into different types.
They do. First, there's differential rent. This is pretty straightforward. It comes from differences in the land itself. Some land is just naturally more fertile or it's closer to the market, reducing transport costs.
So if you farm better land, you produce more easily or cheaper.
Right. With the same amount of capital and labor, you get an extra profit compared to someone farming worse land. But because landowners control access to that better land, they can charge rent that captures that extra profit.
Okay, makes sense. What's next?
Then there's differential rent too. This arises not from natural differences, but from investing more capital onto the same piece of land. Maybe you invest in better drainage or more fertilizer or machinery.
And that makes the land more productive.
Exactly, which generates another layer of extra profit. And again, the landowner can often raise the rent to capture this extra profit that comes from the capital investment, not just the original land quality. The source links this type of rent to capital becoming more concentrated in agriculture over time.
So improvements can actually lead to higher rents.
They can. And finally, there's absolute rent. This one's a bit different. It exists, the argument goes, simply because land is privately owned. It's a monopoly.
How does that create rent?
Because even the worst piece of land that has to be cultivated to meet society's demand for food, even that land has to yield some rent to its owner. Otherwise, why would they let it be used?
So the market price of agricultural goods has to be slightly above the price of production of the worst land, just enough to pay this minimum absolute rent.
That's the idea. Landed property itself acts as a barrier, allowing landowners to claim a slice, regardless of land quality, just for ownership.
And there was that specific, quite shocking example mentioned about Lord Shaftesbury.
Yeah, drawing from a report, it suggests that in some cases, part of what should have been the agricultural worker's basic wage was effectively being deducted and paid over to the landowner as rent.
So the lines between wages, profit, and rent get blurred, and the worker ends up subsidizing the rent.
That's the implication in that example. It really highlights how these different categories, rent, profit, wages, are seen as interconnected ways of distributing the total value produced.
Wow, okay. Volume 3 also briefly mentions trade fluctuations, crises.
Just touches on them, yeah. linking them to factors like the huge productive power of new machinery, potentially outstripping demand, leading to stock accumulation, booms and busts. They're presented as sort of inherent disturbing causes in the system.
Right. Which brings us to maybe the biggest critique in Volume 3, this thing called the Trinity formula.
Ah, yes, the Trinity formula. This is about how the whole economic system appears to its participants.
How so?
Well, think about how we usually talk about the economy. We talk about land, capital, and labor as the factors of production. And it seems like land creates rent, capital creates profit, and labor creates wages.
Right. They seem like three independent sources, each generating its own stream of income. Rent, profit, wages, that's the Trinity.
Exactly. Land rent, capital profit, labor wages. But the critique here in Volume 3 is that this is fundamentally a distortion. It's just the surface appearance.
So what's the underlying reality, according to this analysis?
The reality, as argued consistently from Volume 1, is that value is created by social labor. Rent, profit, and wages aren't independent sources creating different chunks of value.
They are.
They are forms of distribution of the total value that was already created by labor. They are different claims on or revenues derived from that single pool of value.
So it looks like land, capital, and labor are all contributing partners, each creating their own share.
But the argument is that appearance hides the underlying reality where labor creates the value, and then that value gets divided up amongst landowners as rent, capitalists as profit, and workers as wages. The insight is that the very way the system operates masks its own foundation.
That is quite a fundamental critique of how we perceive things. Phew, that was quite a journey through these texts.
It certainly was. A lot to unpack.
We started way back in Volume 1, looking at how value is seen to come from social labor, and then that really interesting idea of commodity fetishism, how human relationships can seem like relationships between things.
Right. And the harsh realities of the working day, the struggle over hours, the impact of machinery, and that often brutal backstory of primitive accumulation.
Then Volume 2 took us through the flow, the circuits of capital, MCPCM, how the whole system keeps reproducing itself through exchanges between departments, and why the speed of turnover is so important for profit. And finally, Volume 3 tackled how that surplus value gets divided, the difference between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, how merchants get their cut, the different kinds of ground rent going to landowners.
And wrapping up with that critique of the Trinity formula, arguing that the common view of land, capital, and labor as separate sources of wealth is just an appearance, masking the distribution of value actually created by labor.
It's definitely dense material, historical, yes, but it raises these fundamental questions about where value comes from, how economies work under the surface, issues of power.
Absolutely. And understanding this perspective, even if you don't agree with all of it, can definitely give you a different lens for looking at economic discussions today. It challenges some common assumptions.
So maybe here's a thought to leave you with. Think about that common way we talk about the economy, wages, rents, and profits. We often treat them as sort of separate results from different inputs. Labor, land, capital.
Right, like three distinct pots of money.
After digging into these specific texts, what does it change if you consider the argument that these aren't separate creations, but actually just different shares being carved out from one underlying source of value, human labor?
What does that shift in perspective do to how you see the economic world? How wealth generation and distribution actually happen?
Something to think about. Definitely something to ponder until our next deep dive.